Tonight, the most dangerous word in the Middle East is not missile. It is not retaliation. It is not even deterrence. It is proximity. Because once Natanz is hit and then Dimona comes under fire, the entire conflict changes shape. Suddenly, this is no longer just another exchange of strikes. It becomes a confrontation orbiting two of the most symbolically explosive places in the region. And when that happens, the world starts asking the same question at once. Are we watching the edge of a nuclear crisis, even if no nuclear weapon has been used? That is what makes this moment so serious. Not because a nuclear bomb went off, not because radiation was reported leaking across borders. At the time of writing, that has not been confirmed. But because sites tied to the nuclear story of both Iran and Israel are now part of the public battle narrative. Natanz, the heart of Iran's enrichment program, gets hit. Then missiles land in Dimona, the southern Israeli city that sits near the Negev Nuclear Research Center, one of the most strategically sensitive places in the country. And in geopolitics, symbolism is not a side effect. Symbolism is often the message. Let's slow this down because the sequence matters. Reports said Natanz was targeted in a U.S.-Israel attack, and officials also said there was no radioactive leak reported from the site. That alone was already a major escalation. Natanz is not just another military facility. It is one of the best-known pieces of Iran's nuclear infrastructure, a site that has long represented Tehran's technical ambition, national prestige, and bargaining power all at once. For years, Natanz has sat at the center of pressure campaigns, sabotage accusations, intelligence operations, red-line speeches, and the global debate over whether Iran's nuclear program is purely civilian or something more strategically flexible. Then came Dimona. And that is where the shock value multiplied. Because Dimona is not just a city in southern Israel. It carries an almost mythic weight in the strategic imagination of the Middle East. When people hear Dimona, they are not thinking about municipal borders or local roads. They are thinking about Israel's nuclear ambiguity, its deterrence posture, its long-standing refusal to openly discuss capabilities everyone already factors into their calculations. So when missiles hit Dimona, even if public reporting points to the town rather than a verified strike on the research center itself, the psychological effect is immediate. The message is clear enough. No place is untouchable forever. And this is where the story becomes bigger than the blast zone. Because Iran did not randomly choose a name that would dominate headlines. Earlier in March, Reuters reported Iran had explicitly warned that if regime change was pursued against it, Israel's Dimona nuclear site could become a target. So when Natanz is struck, and then Dimona is hit in retaliation, what you are seeing is not chaos without logic. You are seeing a threat move from rhetoric into perceived action, even if the exact damage, exact coordinates, and exact intent remain disputed in real time. The sequencing is strategically deliberate. One side hits a nuclear-linked site. The other side answers by targeting a city associated in the global mind with nuclear deterrence. And that is why the phrase nuclear war suddenly starts appearing everywhere, even though it is not technically accurate to say a nuclear war has begun. What people really mean is something slightly different, and almost as dangerous. A conventional war is now circling nuclear symbolism so closely that every future strike will be read through that lens. Every launch warning will sound worse. Every interception failure will feel more consequential. Every rumor will travel faster than facts. And every government in the region will have to consider not only what was hit, but what the public believes was almost hit. Now let's be precise, because precision matters in moments like this. Based on current reporting, there is no confirmed nuclear detonation. There is no confirmed radiation release from Natanz. There's also no clear public confirmation that Iran directly struck the core of Israel's nuclear research complex. What has been reported is that Natanz was targeted, and that missiles struck Dimona, with multiple outlets reporting injuries in the city. BBC Live coverage placed Dimona roughly 13 kilometers, or about 8 miles, from the Negev Nuclear Research Center. That distance matters. It means you can have a strike in Dimona that does not equal a direct hit on the nuclear facility, while still producing maximum strategic alarm. And that alarm may have been part of the point. In modern state conflict, especially between heavily armed rivals trying to avoid total catastrophe while still projecting resolve, coercion is often calibrated. You do not always aim for maximum physical destruction. Sometimes you aim for maximum psychological penetration. You target what the other side cannot ignore. You force the leadership, the public and foreign allies, to feel vulnerability in a place they assumed was protected by layers of secrecy, geography, and defense. That is how missile warfare becomes political theater with real consequences. Think about what Iran is signaling here. If Natanz, one of the most protected and politically loaded sites in Iran, can be attacked, then Tehran wants Israel and the United States to understand that their own most sensitive locations can also be placed under pressure. Not necessarily annihilated, Not necessarily breached in the most dramatic way possible, but pressured, threatened, brought into the war's visible geography. That shift matters because it drags the conflict away from the shadows. This is no longer just covert sabotage, cyber intrigue, or quiet assassinations attributed to nobody. This is open messaging delivered by missiles. For Israel, the implications are just as serious. Israeli strategy has long depended not only on capability, but on the perception of layered protection, intelligence depth, missile defense, rapid response, strategic ambiguity, and the belief that even if attacks happen, the most sensitive national assets remain functionally beyond the enemy's practical reach. A strike on Dimona challenges that perception, even if the actual target was the town and not the core research site. In security terms, perception gaps can be as destabilizing as physical gaps. If the public starts believing sacred strategic spaces are now within range, political pressure on leaders rises immediately. And then there is the United States. Because once Natanz is described as hit in a U.S.-Israel operation, Washington is no longer a distant backer in the story. It is directly implicated in the escalatory ladder. That changes Iran's calculus, Israel's expectations, and the wider region's fears. Gulf states begin watching air defense maps. Oil traders begin watching shipping lanes. Diplomats begin asking whether this can still be contained inside the existing war, or whether nuclear-adjacent targeting turns this into something far more unpredictable. The reason these strikes shake markets and capitals so fast is not just military risk, it is systemic risk. There's also a deeper strategic paradox here. The more both sides flirt with nuclear symbolism, the less likely they may be to actually cross into true nuclear catastrophe, because the costs are so obvious and so enormous. But that does not make the moment safe. In some ways, it makes it more unstable. Why? Because each side may believe it can continue escalating, in the gray zone just below the absolute red line. Strike near the symbol but not through it. Send the message but stop short of the point of no return. The problem is that wars built on just below the line logic are the ones most vulnerable to miscalculation. One navigation error, one failed interception, one faulty assessment, one panicked decision, and the line disappears. This is why Natanz and Dimona together create such a combustible narrative. Alone, each site already carries strategic weight. Together, in the same cycle of attack and retaliation, they create the impression that the war is no longer about front lines alone. It is about existential pressure. Iran sees Natanz as a symbol of sovereignty, technological endurance, and resistance to outside coercion. Israel sees the Dimona complex as part of the deterrence architecture underlying national survival. When both symbols enter the open battlefield conversation in the same week, the conflict stops looking routine, even by the standards of this region. It starts looking like a test of nerves between two states trying to show they can threaten what the other holds most sacred. And there's another reason this matters. The audience is bigger than Iran and Israel. Every actor in the region is learning from this exchange. Hezbollah is watching. Gulf monarchies are watching. Washington is watching. Moscow is watching. Beijing is watching. So are every military planner and risk analyst asking the same question. If wars can now be fought through attacks on nuclear-adjacent symbols without triggering immediate global de-escalation, does that become the new model of coercion? Because if it does, then the threshold for future crises may not be lower in theory, but it becomes more crowded in practice. More actors may decide that striking near strategic taboo zones is a viable way to send messages without fully crossing the ultimate line. And that brings us to the media effect, which should not be underestimated. A missile hits Dimona, and within minutes, the internet does what it always does in moments like this. It jumps to the most extreme interpretation. Viral clips detach from context. Old videos resurface. Claims race ahead of confirmation. Earlier in March, Reuters had already published a fact check saying there was no credible evidence for one viral claim implying Dimona's nuclear site had been struck. That matters, because when the next real strike happens nearby, the information environment is already primed for exaggeration. In a nuclear-adjacent crisis, misinformation is not background noise. It is part of the escalation dynamic. Leaders do not just respond to missiles. They respond to panic, pressure, and perception. So is this nuclear war? No, not in the literal sense, not based on the facts currently reported. But is this a nuclear flashpoint? Absolutely. And that may be the more useful phrase anyway, because it captures what is actually happening. The war is entering a zone where nuclear infrastructure, nuclear symbolism, and nuclear psychology are shaping the conflict even without nuclear weapon use. That alone is enough to transform strategic behavior. The danger is not only what has happened. The danger is how future moves will now be interpreted. After this, every strike on southern Israel, every report from Iranian nuclear facilities, every alert involving missile defense will be processed through a far more dangerous mental framework. The next question is whether this was meant as a warning shot or the opening of a new doctrine. If Iran's message is, you hit Natanz, we can touch Dimona, then the retaliation is as much about restoring deterrence as about revenge. It says Iran will not allow its strategic sites to be targeted without imposing strategic anxiety in return. If Israel's answer is to intensify pressure on missile infrastructure, command nodes, or additional nuclear-linked sites, then the cycle keeps climbing. And once each side believes it must answer symbolism with symbolism, the war becomes harder to cool. Not because either side wants apocalypse, but because neither side wants to look vulnerable after being challenged at the level of national survival imagery. That is why the scariest part of this story is not a confirmed nuclear event. It is normalization. A few years ago, a headline linking Natanz and Dimona in the same exchange would have sounded almost unthinkable. Now it sounds like the latest update in a rapidly moving conflict. That shift should worry anyone paying attention, because once the unthinkable becomes thinkable, the next step becomes easier to imagine, easier to threaten, and easier to justify domestically. Wars do not always leap into catastrophe in one move. Sometimes they walk there through a series of still-below-the-line decisions that each feel temporary until the pattern becomes permanent. So where does this leave us tonight? With one hard truth. The missile that struck Dimona may not have needed to hit a reactor to change the war. The attack on Natanz may not have caused a radiological disaster to send a strategic shockwave through the region. The effect comes from the linkage itself. One side touched the symbol of the other's nuclear future. The other answered by touching the geography surrounding the symbol of its rival's deterrent mystery. That is why capitals are tense, markets are watching, and the world suddenly feels one step closer to a category of crisis nobody wants to name too confidently. Because this is how major escalations often begin, not with the final disaster, but with the warning that the map of restraint is being redrawn in real time. And tonight, the real question is not whether the Middle East has already entered a nuclear war. It hasn't, based on what is publicly known right now. The real question is whether Natanz and Dimona have now become the new language of deterrence in this conflict. If the answer is yes, then what happened here was not just retaliation. It was a message about the next stage of the war. And that message may be the most dangerous strike of all.